Sarah Holt is a producer, a longtime producer with Nova, and produced the recent piece, Decoding COVID-19. And Sarah, you were really kind of early on this story, and while most of us were being told, don't leave your home, even reporters, even visual storytellers, you were actually out there producing a piece to help us understand largely the science behind COVID-19 and what makes it unique, what is a coronavirus, how we can start to think about addressing it. And when you and I spoke the other day, you said, I hope you don't mind if I quote you, but you said, I made every mistake in the book. And I think that's what we're really here to talk about, is that this is uncharted territories, even for the most experienced producers. So talk to us about your process and what you learned along the way.
Well, what I realized was that every situation was unique. There were some labs that would allow us to send in a skeletal clues. We'd send in a cameraman and a sound man. I would do the interviews remotely. But what that meant was that all of a sudden a 10-hour day had to be a 14-hour day because there weren't enough people to move equipment, and we were sanitizing, we were social distancing. There were places that would only do Zoom interviews or Skype interviews, like the NIH. We couldn't send in any equipment, any crews. And so, you know, I had a lot of problems on my early interviews getting the eyeline right. And we were trying to have our talent record QuickTime movies and, you know, audio on cell phones. And sometimes they did it correctly and sometimes they didn't. Finally, we started sending in these tiny consumer cameras, hoping we can get a better image quality. And we couldn't control what we were seeing. So we got wildly different eye lines. It worked best when we had an assistant cameraman outside the apartment or the house with everything set up. Sometimes we did interviews outside and they could be outside to make sure the eye line was right. And I know now that Frontline and many other groups have figured out how to be able to send in a higher quality camera that will let the background go out of focus and actually control what you're seeing. But the other issue we had was just, quarantining. I mean, and that's a big issue going forward. People want you to be quarantined for 2 weeks before you come in. And I was swapping out cameramen that all of a sudden had shoots that took them across the country. And I couldn't say to a lab that was going to let me send in a crew, this person has not been traveling for 2 weeks.
Wow. So so they would go on the shoot, they would need to quarantine for 2 weeks, and then they could go back out.
Anyone that was going to come into the labs for shooting
Right.
had to have been in quarantine for 2 weeks in a bubble.
Wow. And so then that puts you as a producer either having to find different crews, right, for different scenarios. And in a situation where the continuity is already challenging, that must have been really hard. I want to set the frame since we're not showing this. And by the way, it's Nova. This COVID-19 is available to everybody. It's a really fascinating piece because it does break down how this virus works in I think, a really clear way for normal people who are not scientists. In terms of just laying out what's in it, I was kind of taking note of the different interviews you did. You did indoor interviews, you did outdoor interviews, you did what seemed to be Zoom interviews. And sometimes it looked like there was a cinematographer there indoors. You could see the rack focus. So you're talking about each situation that was really dictated a lot in your scenario, it sounds like, by the people that you were interviewing. In terms of what worked best for you, or what were the things that you thought like, okay, this is a way that we actually can work moving forward?
Well, I'm sure now that we have good enough camera packages that we can do remote interviews and control what we're seeing. The eye line in that film, if you watch it, is all over the place. It was painful to watch. Wherever you can send in a crew, it's great. But there are a lot of people that aren't comfortable with that. And I mean, even now, as I think about moving forward, if I fly somewhere, people want me to quarantine for 2 weeks before I come into their labs or their homes. It was also hard to find stories. And the other thing is that films aren't just interviews. So we had crews in Washington and New York going out and shooting, images of ambulances and a virtual birthday party. And, we told everybody, keep your distance, don't take any risk. But, using long lenses, we were able to make the film much more visual than I ever imagined. In the beginning, I wasn't sure how we were going to make the film visual.
Right, and you have a character in China as well, who's a big part of the narrative, and I was wondering how you got that, because that seems very intimate, and he has such a powerful story. How did that work?
Well, we were incredibly lucky because we had a team in China already there. We didn't go through the authorities. Wuhan was opening up. There were no new cases of COVID being reported. And we had someone who recovered from COVID. So we actually sent a crew into Wuhan to film the opening of Wuhan through the eyes of this patient. And that was just a normal shoot. I mean,
Right.
I'm worried about kind of not going through official channels in China to get the footage, but everything worked out well. But at the end of all of these shoots, I always was relieved when 2 weeks had passed and no one had gotten sick. No one had gotten infected. I mean, that was always a worry on the back of my mind.
Right, right. And we talked about, I mean, I think part of the frame of this conversation and why I wanted to introduce you first is that a lot of times people think, oh, if you're producing for Nova, if you're producing for Frontline, you're staff. And so you have all the resources of staff producers, but that's not really the case. Most of the pieces produced for both of those strands are independent producers. So what was what kind of onus was on you as an independent producer to make sure you had everything you needed, whether it be the budget to quarantine, whether it be PPE? I mean, what did that really require from you as an independent?
Well, first of all, no one could get masks. So the only thing that saved me was the cameramen that I hired had N95 masks in their basement. Everyone had to provide their own personal protective gear, which seems kind of crazy. But I heard you say, the station couldn't have given it to me, even if they wanted to, and I couldn't get it, and I couldn't give it to my crew. But there are lots of new budgetary concerns shooting in a pandemic. People can't drive. Normally when you're doing a shoot, you kind of carpool and limit the number of cars, and now everyone's going in their own car. It's taking longer each day. I mean, what you could accomplish in 10 hours now is 12 or 14. I think that, I've been talking to producers that are now trying to think of shooting in Europe, and, quarantining for 14 days in a European city seems cost prohibitive.
Right.
The other thing is that, I didn't know what would happen if, we sent a camera crew to someone's porch, and then after the shoot, they'd been in quarantine and someone got sick. Would we be liable? You hope everyone's keeping social distance, and that's why I tried to do as many shoots outside as I could.
Right.
But still in the back of my mind, I'm an independent producer, and ultimately I'm responsible for the safety of the people I hire and the people I interview.
Right. And I had a long discussion, public discussion about insurance yesterday, and that's a black hole. We just don't really know. Well, thank you, Sarah. We're going to come back to you and talk more, but thank you for that setup. And I want to introduce and ask Roberto Roldan to join us. Roberto is a correspondent and reporter with Virginia Public Media and has been reporting on the uprisings over the last, I don't know how many days it is now. Are we talking 14 days, 20 days? Now I'm losing track, Roberto.
I think we're here on the 17th or 19th. So it began sort of the first weekend, that Friday night after the shooting of George Floyd in Minneapolis. So I want to say that was the 28th or the 29th.
So thank you for joining us. I mean, you are one of the more than 400 plus reporters, citizen journalists, filmmakers who did have a confrontation with the authorities. Can you set that up for us a little bit? And I just want to talk about that because it is I think, unique situation for reporters to be in this defensive mode and potentially in danger. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, so we were out there almost the entire day from 9 a.m. until I believe when the incident occurred around 10 or 11 o'clock. But to make a sort of long story short, we were covering protests at night here in the city after a couple days of what were riots and looting. A curfew of 8 p.m. was instituted here in the city of Richmond, and so we were out after curfew. Journalists were obviously exempt from these orders, following a crowd along a main street when, without warning or any warning that I heard or my photographer heard, the police line that was behind the protest group of about 400 or 500 people fired tear gas into the crowd. A lot of folks scattered at that point. Me and my photographer started planning sort of an exit strategy to get out of the area. when we encountered another police line basically on a side street. And at that point, we had heard messaging from the police department that the safest place to be in these situations is on the other side of the police line. Don't put yourself in between police and protesters. So we approached, me and my photographer, the police line, and almost as soon as we identified ourselves, sort of physically with our press ID badges, as well as verbally saying, we are with the press. Both me and my photographer were pepper sprayed, and another officer from behind the police line came forward, charged me and shoved me to the ground. Fortunately, after that, we again attempted to go behind the police line, and that time we were able. So at that point, we kind of had an exit strategy there to get me and my photographer out of downtown Richmond. I think after the tear gas, we were maybe considering continuing on for the night after taking a short break, but tear gas, pepper spray, and the assault, we were like, we need to call an editor and get out of here quickly.
Right. And then you've had to go back night after night, right? That's been your story, and you've been following it. So what have you done, knowing that this is possible, knowing that these are the circumstances that you're reporting in? How have you done anything different to try to protect yourself and your crew?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. I think our frustration with that incident, that was the first time that I had personally gone out to the protests. And I think our frustration with that incident that occurred in the first weekend was that we felt that we had done everything right. We had identified ourselves as members of the press. We had high visibility vests on that we thought would sort of distinguish us from the crowd and let perhaps police officers know that we weren't trying to hide or evade. We were trying to be seen as members of the press. So I think our frustration was that we had done everything that we thought we could do right. And yet that incident still happened. So I think it's sort of two things. One, making sure that we're better prepared in case things do go bad. Prepared with, either a milk water mixture or some of these like baby shampoo soaked wipes to remove tear gas or pepper spray from your face. So I think for us, it wasn't necessarily that we did anything wrong initially, but just we're more prepared for if things do go bad. And obviously having two people out there, both a photographer and a reporter, helps a lot because you really do have to keep your head on a swivel in these situations.
Right. Just a couple tips just for people who are out there that my, colleagues at the J School reminded me. It's like your head and your eyes are the most important things. So a helmet is a great idea. Yep. And also, this is not the time to go out and do solo reporting. However you're doing it, if you're a filmmaker, if you're a citizen journalist, if you're a journalist from a newsroom, you don't go out alone. You really need multiple sets of eyes watching what's unfolding. And, protests in the United States have always been among the more dangerous places to report, but it seems like the level of aggression that's being levied against the press is unusual in this time. And it's unusual to see it, so widespread. Can we talk a tiny bit before we go on to our next guest, just about, there's something that happens that people don't maybe think about. They think like, we're going to go out, we're going to capture this. This is a historic moment. What they might not think about are some of the legal repercussions. And I'm not talking about, let's get into the weeds of any cases or investigations, but like, then you actually need to get a lawyer. Once you're in those circumstances, especially if you're a member of the press, then you need to get a lawyer. So can you talk about, what people might need to be thinking about, what could happen to them in terms of those repercussions, which are behind the scenes?
Yeah, so I mean, shortly after that incident, in my day-to-day life, I guess just to back up real quick, in my day-to-day, before coronavirus and we all sort of became health reporters, I normally cover City Hall, so I have a decent relationship with both the mayor's office and with City Council because that's kind of what I normally cover. And I had tweeted about the incident that occurred. The mayor of Richmond had followed up and requested through the police department that an internal investigation be launched into whether or not there was an excessive use of force on members of the press. That's sort of playing out now, but I think one of the things that I've been extremely grateful for is that as a reporter for an established news organization and not necessarily a freelancer, we have media lawyers, and I've been able to utilize that resource through my station as a way of, ensuring that we are trying to get some level of justice, really, for what occurred. But I think, that's not necessarily something that I was prepared for or thinking about when I went out that first night. And I think especially for a freelance documentarian or a freelance journalist who might not have that backing, that might be a different story,
right?
In
Absolutely.
terms of having that representation.
Absolutely. And I don't know if I can put this in the chat, I can share it later, but IDA, along with the Witness, which is a human rights organization, put together a list of resources. If you are going out there, everything from how to prepare for tear gas or how to even know whether you've been assaulted with a tear gas agent, to lawyers, emergency, legal counsel. So thank you, Roberto. We'll come back to you shortly. I'm going to our next guest, filmmaker Jackie Olive. Jackie, are you there?
Hi, Carrie.
Hi, Jackie is an independent filmmaker. I can't quite see you. Let me see. Let me just make sure that I'm not missing something. There you are.
I believe my video's on, yes.
Jack is an independent filmmaker. Her recent film is Always in Season, which recently broadcast on Independent Lens. Jackie, is that available for streaming right now on Independent Lens?
It's available now, I think, through PBS membership on the ITBS and PBS website, and it'll be available to the public soon for streaming.
Okay, great. And there were a couple things as we were thinking about this panel, Jackie. Things are moving so quickly. Every day feels just like a new reality and a new discussion. But one of the reasons I really wanted you to join the conversation is twofold. One is that your film, in some ways, it's like for better or for worse, is every day has more and more urgency and more relevance. The film is about, well, do you want to set it up? I can set it up, but do you want to set up the film?
I can, yeah. Always in Season examines the lingering impact of more than a century of lynching African Americans. And I connect that history of racial terrorism through the case of, to racial violence today through the case of a 17-year-old named Lennon Lacy who was found hanging from a swing set in 2014, about 20 days after the uprising in Ferguson, Missouri, after Mike Brown was gunned down by police there. I follow Lennon's mother's, Claudia's, fight for an FBI investigation into that case. And she's still seeking justice.
And now we're seeing really what seems like, every day, more Black men being found hanging. Under unclear circumstances. Departments are immediately calling them suicides, and the communities are saying, no, you need to look at this. And then even here, I live in the Bay Area, I don't know if you heard, on Lake Merritt, there were a series of nooses hung from a tree. And so I think in terms of the dangers we face, and one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is like, one of the dangers we face is terror.
Absolutely.
Right? How do we tell these stories when there's not even just the overt physical threats that Roberto just talked about, but a much deeper and in some ways scarier, I think, underlying threat or veiled threat of real mass, violence.
Yeah, I'll just say that when making Always in Season, I spent 10 years making the film, and I researched other cases similar to Lennon's. And so the film really explores Lennon's death and the way that institutions showed up around that, including journalism and policing around his death. I explored it in the context of other hangings since 2000 that have gone on, including the ones that you had mentioned, and most recently, well, not even sadly most recently, but in Southern California of Robert Fuller and Malcolm Harsh. There was another case just last night. And so, they've been happening repeatedly. And so one of the projects I'm working on is looking at those particular cases as well. There needs to be a comprehensive look at what's going on, a comprehensive understanding of these deaths, and to figure out whether or not they're lynchings or suicides. In my really cursory research, I found that there have been nearly 200 cases since 2000 of Black people found hanging publicly. And so when I made Always in Season, it wasn't a surprise, Lennon's death. It was really stunning and really difficult to take in that this is happening again, but it wasn't a surprise. As are these cases that have happened since. And Sonia Childress, who's now the senior fellow at the Perspective Fund, really brilliantly put it in a blog article that she wrote recently called A Reckoning, And she said that our work as Black filmmakers in particular is often work around justice narrative, justice around our narrative, and being able to tell the stories that we know in the way that we see them unfold. And the fact that largely there's a lot of surprise in this country around what's going on since George Floyd was murdered, and the uprising and the movement that's happened since that's a surprise is really an indicator of the narrow point of view in which these stories are being told, the American story in particular. And it can be stories about Black and brown people in our community that are told by other folks that don't necessarily do that with the urgency and the accuracy that they deserve.
Right. And if AFI, I don't know if this is possible, but putting that essay in the chat would be amazing. It's an incredible article. And to me, I wrote to her and said, you know, everything that you've said, I felt in my gut, but could never really articulate, you know, and with such clarity as she did. So
it's brilliant. And I see it playing out as I see. There's also the narrative about lynching just happening to Black men is really harmful because it happened to women and children as well historically, in smaller numbers, but it certainly happened. One of the photographs that I saw first of the hangings was of a woman, Laura Nelson, who was hanged across from her 14-year-old son, LD, from a bridge in Okima, Oklahoma. And so you have this case most recently, I believe, between May 27th and currently in the last 2 weeks or so, of TT Gully, a trans woman who was found hanging in Portland. And that case has gotten relatively little press. None of the cases have gotten the press that they deserve, but that case has been dismissed because it turns out that TT was not a man, that TT was a trans woman. And so we need to really look at how we tell these narratives and how we approach these stories to make sure that we're doing it with accuracy and really with the compassion that these families and communities deserve.
Right. And I mean, that goes to the questions of who should be telling those stories too. Someone last week, you know, said to me, if you're not willing to be out there on the streets, maybe you shouldn't be telling the stories, which is, you know.
It's true. If you, it's as a Black filmmaker, I'm compelled to tell these stories. And so in the midst of a COVID, and I'm sheltering in place when I'm not out and working and grocery shopping, right, is that I'm really sensitive to being safe and making sure that other people are safe. And yet I'm compelled. These are the stories that need to be told that are going on right now. And so it's this balance between like, one is doing this with limited resources as an independent filmmaker and limited protection in terms of insurance and all those things that make you more confident in going out and doing the work that we do. I'm balancing that at the same time as the need to tell the stories. Right. And I'll also say that with the protests, there's an obvious danger, but there's actual physical danger. When I made Always in Season, I interviewed a lot of people who were at least initially adversarial, including former Klansmen and Klansmen. And so there are many situations in which most of us are putting ourselves or risking physical danger and having to think through that and prepare.
Right. And I want to remind people too that it's our communities that are most at risk for COVID as well. So when we're out there, we're also thinking about who we're bringing things home to. And I know I like to remind people too that you're a former firefighter, so you've been on the front lines of public safety, and so that might come into play soon. So thank you, Jackie. We'll bring you back in a moment, and I'm going to introduce our next guest, Nosheen Dadaboy, who is a cinematographer and director, and is currently working on a film about a group of incredible female activists in the Muslim community. Hi, Nosheen, how are you? Thank you for joining us. So Nosheen, you and I had a discussion just a week ago about some of these very issues, but actually as a cinematographer who really depends on going out there and filming things for your livelihood, I really was struck by all of the concerns that you raised last week about your own safety and, you know, the kinds of shoots that you're being asked to do and the kinds of questions that you have about everything from, you know, hazard pay to PPE. So I'm just wondering if you could set a frame for us about the types of things as an independent cinematographer that you're thinking about when you're getting these calls.
I mean, I think what I mentioned in our earlier call was that often, like, I'm thinking about this not just from like a COVID perspective or talking about the protests. This is just like a day-to-day thing as a cinematographer or a sound person, you know, as below the line crew. We really do put our like health and safety in the hands of production, and what kind of preparation production takes for our health and safety. And sometimes, you know, it's really secondary to the story, and it's always really fascinating when that happens around a story that's about social justice. And like, often I'm also hired by like a very white team to be a brown body to bring comfort to usually brown and Black people in front of the camera. And, you know, and then you're putting my brown body also in harm's way too. So there's just like layers of things that you're thinking through in those scenarios. But, you know, often it's really basic things when like something is like for instance, the uprisings, like something just, you know, happens and it's like, we have to respond very quickly. But I think we right now especially need to like pause and think about like, how we respond to those things and how we bring our crews into those situations, because like you're going out into the field without like a game plan, like often without a call sheet. We don't know if we're going to be indoors or outdoors. What are we filming? You know, and sometimes you're in like, you don't have like basic necessities like water provided for you. And now thinking about all of that and then adding this layer of like COVID and maybe filming in uprisings, that really gives me pause and like makes me think about like, okay, who are these people that are hiring me? What is like, how much of my health and safety are they putting into consideration? And, you know, and so it's basic things like people have been reaching out to me right now and they're like, oh, do you want to go and shoot a COVID doc? Not really. I mean, you know, I like, because I think there's a lot of things that we haven't worked out. Like one, in terms of like, who's going to take care of us if we get sick, you know, who's paying for a quarantine period, if that is something that we have to do. But also like, I think my biggest frustration is, are we even having a conversation about how we can film to keep our crews safe? And a lot of times people are just opting for like, well, put on a mask and gloves and we're gonna, you know, this is a verite film. Well, I think we really have to be thinking outside the box right now in terms of creative approaches and thinking about ways that we can keep our crew safe. And that doesn't only maybe mean remote filming. I think there's other ways to approach that. And I think it means more transparency and conversations with your crew.
Right. And looking at some of the pieces that we'll talk about today, you know, Sarah's COVID piece, some of the frontline pieces, I mean, you can see those adjustments happening and unfolding from really high quality Zoom interviews. And, you know, with interviews, it's really about what the person is saying, not so much how it looks, you know, or using archival or using, you know, crowdsourced footage that people are getting on their phones. And I think being more open. In terms of what, you know, the things that you want to put out there, like what would it take for you? If I call you and I say, okay, Nasheen, I'd really love for you to come do this shoot. I mean, what are kind of some of the basic things right now that it would take to convince you to even consider it?
I mean, I think most importantly is like, is this important right now? And is this necessary? And you outlined that really perfectly in your article. And that's something, you know, that we should be thinking about in terms of like storytelling anyway, but especially like right now is like, is this important for me to not just put myself and my family's health and safety at risk, but also like, what are we asking of the subject right now? So that's like, you know, the first thing. And then it's like, okay, if I need a lot of transparency on like, what are we going to be filming? What is the location? Are we indoors or outdoors? It has to be a 10-hour day. Like we can't be asking people to do long days and then also think that they're going to have the capacity to be, you know, considering all the safety concerns around them. And it also, like, you know, I would want to have input on what the protocol is in terms of like safety, if it was the uprising or if it was COVID or both, but like, you know, just to know that there is a plan in place from the production, to know that they have like considered that like they have PPE available. Hazard pay, I think has to be a must right now. You know, I think if like having like a solid game plan, like even right now, like for instance, people are hiring DPs to go out solo. I could go out solo and shoot LA city streets, but if I had a production contact me and say like, hey, we Google map this because we can do that now. These are all the intersections that we need you to go and film. These are the shots that we want. I can knock that out in 2 hours instead of trying to hunt around for what you might want in like 10 hours.
Right, right. Well, there's a lot of, it's interesting because there's the reality of what Sarah said she just dealt with, which is it's longer days because there's more to consider, right? And that her crew had to have their own PPE, and some of them just happened to have N95s. I think if you live in California, you have a stash of N95s because of the wildfires, but not everybody has access to that. So I want to thank you, Nosheen. I want to bring in Rainey next, because Rainey's the person, the executive on our panel, who actually has to meet all of these demands. So thanks, Nosheen. I'll bring you back shortly, and I'll bring Rainey up. How are you, Rainey? Oops, you're still on mute. So Rainey Aaronson is executive producer of Frontline, and a longtime colleague, and I'm a big fan, and have been following avidly, Rainey, all the work that Frontline has been doing. I mean, you are out there. You've already turned around 3 pieces, and I know you have others in the works, both about COVID and about the kind of historic moment that we're in. So putting on your executive hat and the person who's ultimately responsible for all of these individuals on our panel who work for you, how are you meeting this moment, and what are your challenges?
You know, I love that question, and I actually really appreciated hearing from the makers on the panel about some of the challenges they're having, and I really, really appreciate all of that feedback. So from our perspective, you know, Frontline's very accustomed to working in very dangerous environments. It's typically overseas. So if you look at the history of our programming, a lot of the films that I've commissioned really do take place in war zones, for example, places like Syria, or if you look at public health crises covering Ebola in West Africa. And so we are very accustomed to working with producers and equipping them with what we believe is very safe protocols around what they do. So, and we hire people that we know are able to work in those environments safely. So I'll give you a great example. Our Italy film, which was filmed inside a hospital in Italy, right as the peak was happening, and then through the peak, and then as it subsided, was the producer for us on our big Ebola film in West Africa just a few years earlier. So we worked with her on setting, you know, very serious protocols. Before it's been everywhere, what do reporters and filmmakers do? We were thinking very strategically about how to keep our reporters safe. If anybody ever shoots in public, we have a whole list. It's a very intense protocol that people go through, and we do, in those cases, provide equipment. So it's true that our producers and PPE, right? So it is true that our producers are independent, but Frontline treats them more like part of our family. So I'm just as concerned about our filmmakers in the fields as I am, frankly, about the people who work in our office as I am about my own family. Like, we really do try hard to keep our people safe. And I'm very involved with all of that, myself personally, as well as our managing editor. Many other people on my staff are very involved in this. I was just going to say a word. You know, Roberto's story is really alarming. And you mentioned the fact that the United States, you know, during the protests in Minneapolis, we did have a filmmaker go. He was, you know, with a number of other filmmakers that we all know. So it's a very small circle of current affairs filmmakers. And, you know, we didn't let him shoot a frame without a helmet, a gas mask, protective gear that was, you know, both for his chest, his heart. He even had ballistic eye protection. So we essentially treated him as if he was going into a war zone, which we, you know, again, we have experience. But it's unusual to have to do that here, but we always assume the worst, and then we come out hopefully safer. It doesn't mean we always come out safe and that we don't get in trouble, but it means at least we've done our best thinking around it.
Well, you said that the other day, and I actually wanted you to talk about this, that your philosophy has become to assume the worst. And this could be probably on any story, right? Because when you're doing investigative work, there's all kinds of risks. There's always risk. And so I think that that actually is a good risk management way of thinking, but it's not something all independents have access to. So talk to us about that philosophy of I'm going to assume the worst, prepare for the worst, and what that means for you.
I mean, I think it's come with experience in my job, and I'm the one ultimately responsible for the safety of all of these people. You know, first of all, I care deeply about them all. They're all like individuals to me, and I'm a filmmaker myself. It's not like I come out of another side of management. I was making films for years before I went into running Frontline. So I think I still operate as if I'm a filmmaker in the field myself. That's kind of my mindset. So what would I want? And what I would want is an executive team that cares about our safety and provides it, and that you don't have to scramble. So one of the things you mentioned is that, you know, we at Frontline, you know, we are blessed in a way to have a budget that we can provide, you know, more substantive support. That ranges from our legal support of filmmakers all the way to our production support. But actually, it's mostly because we prioritize that. We could be spending that money on something else. I know that when I took over Frontline, for example, I made sure that we had a security firm that actually did an independent assessment of our teams in the field. And that was in part because I was an executive taking over Frontline. I wanted to make sure things were running properly. It was also because I was willing to acknowledge that is not my executive, you know, team's actual experience. So we needed to hire a firm to help us actually do that. And we monitor our teams constantly. And I'm one of the people who is on that that alert list. So we treat it like it's an emergency room. In other words, something can happen at any point. And so we always have to be on high alert.
Right. And when you're in a newsroom, the beauty of a newsroom is you always have an exit strategy. I mean, I think that's what independent filmmakers don't realize is that when we send people out, we don't send them out and just say, okay, we'll see you in 2 weeks. There's a strategy, there are check-ins. Sometimes you have a GPS tracker. You have all the gear that you talked about. I mean, I talked about that with my students. It's like, we're not sending you to the protest because you don't have all this gear and we can't get it for you.
And that's frustrating for some filmmakers. They want to just go. We had a filmmaker actually in Salt Lake City. She's a really, really talented filmmaker, and we wouldn't let her go until she had the proper gear. So we're making difficult decisions that, you know, go on the safety side all the time. I would say that, like, if you look at the evidence right now, we should all be hyper vigilant about our safety. That ranges from anything to do with your digital safety, right? Your digital privacy, all the way to your physical safety and privacy. I mean, we just saw what happened to Maria Reza in the Philippines. I don't think that necessarily the United States would do that exactly, but I do think we're in a hostile environment, and we should all, you know, just have our eyes wide open.
And, you know, I've been talking to our colleagues around the news world. So, you know, ProPublica or Mother Jones, and they have a choice. They can choose not to send people out, but you don't have a choice. So I'm just wondering, you know, watching the most recent Frontline, Marty Smith's piece, it's like, you know, the beautiful remote interviews worked perfectly.
That's right. So Marty, in that case, he did everything remote. We've done 3 films since the pandemic, and 2 of those films were shot in the field, and 1 was shot remotely. And that's another thing that I work with my producers with, like, what did they want to do? How do they want to do it? In Marty's case, actually, he wanted to do a film about the world, right? He wanted to do the film about the whole spread of the virus. So he couldn't travel, right? So by necessity, we created a new way to shoot interviews. And Sarah talked about that, but we've created a ton of different ways of shooting interviews now, remotely.
Well, thank you, Rainey. I want to bring everyone up and do the kind of Hollywood squares of Zoom life, if everyone can join and turn their cameras back on and start to open it to some Q&A, but also do some follow-up. I mean, one of the reasons you all were asked to join us today is that you do come from different perspectives, but I do really feel strongly we are all in it together. These stories must be told, and we have to figure out a way to do it. As you all know, you know, I was the first one to say it's not safe. And I still think that. I mean, when you look at the reopening, and I'm wondering if any of you can speak to this, we are, you know, the economic pressures have, it seems, outweighed safety concerns. And so what does that actually mean now? Because I think it's, Sarah, that might have been the safest time to shoot when everybody was sheltered in place. You know, now without masks and requirements, I mean, what happens next? And I'm wondering if you guys can talk about that. And I see Sarah and I see Rainey, so maybe we can start with you, Sarah, and then Rainey can weigh in, and then I'd love to ask the rest of our guests to join us if they're not here.
Well, the only one thing that I do think is different is we have more knowledge. You know, at the time when we were working, we were worried about, we were decontaminating every piece of equipment we would send out and send back. And I think we're a little more assured that it's much more the air droplets we breathe. So in some ways, I think I feel a little bit more confident trying to set up shoots. But there is the risk that the virus is still out there, and you have wildly different scenarios. You don't know if you're going to be on the plane that's packed or the plane that's going to have, you know, middle seats that are empty.
Right. Jackie, I'm wondering if you could speak to this. I'm curious, as a former frontline worker, what you think, because the reality is the masks are good if everybody's wearing them, and that includes the people you're interviewing. So, you know, when you think about risk, I'm just really curious from your perspective what this looks like.
Yeah, a couple of things that Nasheen said and Sarah said make me think of the fact that as an independent filmmaker, I'm also thinking about my crew, and we should all be thinking about crew safety, not just the larger production companies. And so all of those questions that you're asking are questions that I ask myself. And independent filmmakers, we do think about safety, and I certainly think about best practices for making sure that I'm safe, my crew's safe, and the people that we're filming with are safe. And we decide what we're going to do based on the resources that we have. And so all of those things we're considering. I find that it's actually harder now that things have opened up to film with folks who feel more comfortable. And so I film with a DP. I filmed with a DP only, so it's a really small, it's very lean in the context of the lean crews that I normally have. And we are in PPE and we're covered head to toe, even when they don't have it on. And I remind that I remind us that we need to stay 6 feet apart, and that we want to signal that we're concerned about their safety as well, even when they're more lax and less concerned. And so we're looking at, you know, do we shoot verite, or do we use a longer lens as we're shooting verite, and do we do a virtual interview? All of those things are considered in the context of story and in the context of our process when we're filming.
Yeah, this is, you know, this issue of liability waivers. So we know that crew are being asked to sign liability waivers, and I have so much ambivalence about this. I don't know if we know what the liabilities are exactly, but then I also realized, are we asking the people that we're interviewing or the subjects to sign those as well? Rainey and Nasheen, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on those waivers and what they really mean, and you know, who it does or does not protect.
That's a super interesting question. I'd love to hear what Nasheen says too. I mean, generally speaking, I'm not in favor of them, because I feel like, you know what, people who go to war and shoot for us, we don't ask them to sign waivers, right? So we say instead, if you get hurt when you're filming, we're going to take care of you. We're going to medvac you out. We're going to take care of you like we would take care of anyone, right? And inside our employee, you know, circle, even if you're not officially an employee, we take care of you. And the biggest problem is you can't get insurance for COVID. So why companies are starting to ask for this is for that reason. So we haven't started to do that yet. We have been making sure that our filmmakers have health insurance, that their health insurance is good. We've been adding insurance to them. You know, we've been sort of fortifying their insurance so that if they do get sick, we can make sure they're insured. And then we haven't had that situation yet, but we really haven't gone the waiver route. But we might need to in the future if necessary, like WGBH might decide to do that, but so far Frontline's not. And again, it's just my ethos that we send people to dangerous places all the time and don't ask them to do that, so.
Nasheen, are you seeing those? And what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, that's an indicator to me that somebody is not concerned about my health and safety. Like, you know, that's secondary to their story. So I wouldn't put myself in that situation. But I also think there's going to be a lot of filmmakers that, of course, can't afford to say, like, we can beef up your insurance. We can, you know, provide this and that and the other for you. And that really then comes down to trust. And like, do I trust that, do I have an established relationship with this person? Do I want to put my health and safety in their hands? And again, is this story important enough for all of those things? And I also think that the other piece of this to consider is, like, a lot of people, as you said, are feeling pressured by the economics of it. So even if people are saying, yeah, it's cool, I'll go out, I mean, a lot of people are just really worried about their livelihoods right now, and like are saying it's okay, but we're not really okay. We're all really scared.
Right, right. I mean, to that point, Roberto, you are going out there every day. I'm assuming that it's the masks are really hit or miss at some of these protests. You know, how are you protecting yourself, and do you feel like you have what you need when you go out there? And to the earlier point of Nasheen saying, okay, when I have someone go out and say, get this corner, get this corner, get this corner, you know, how targeted of a story are you telling when you go back out night after night?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that we do, at least I personally have the feeling that our organization is backing us. I think the first couple nights we actually didn't go out. We monitored from home or went out for a very targeted specific angle or getting, you know, a soundbite or a photo that we knew we wanted. And I think from that point, we approached it as who is comfortable putting themselves in these situations. No one has ever been forced to go out into these situations if they don't feel comfortable. And then the questions are always, is there something that I can do to support you? Is there something that you need? So when we saw that journalists, not necessarily in Richmond, but in some other locations who are dealing with the same sort of civil unrest, were being blinded by rubber bullets or foam grenades, we went out and I said, hey, I'm at Home Depot. I want to buy this eye protection. Is this something that I could get the station to reimburse me for as something to protect myself when I'm doing news gathering? And the answer was obviously yes. So I think, you know, we are trying to ensure that we have plans in place to make sure people are safe. And I think I can probably speak for the whole news team that we have that when we go out, we do feel like we are being backed. And I think that is really important to feel like when you're in a dangerous situation, that if things do go wrong, someone's going to have your back.
Right, right. There are some questions. I'm trying to catch up here, so bear with me in terms of the chat. This is a question that I think is really interesting, and we're seeing more of, which is that there seem to be some right-wing extremists going into certain situations. You know, we're realizing now that the federal officers who were shot, it appears, was by a right-wing extremist. And so are you all, you know, experiencing that out on the front lines, and how are you approaching that? And maybe Rainey, we'll start with you on that one. And I don't know if Jackie and Roberto have anything to add on that.
I mean, we've definitely seen an increase of that kind of, you know, the threats around that with our reporters who are in the field, especially those who are reporting on the rise of hate. We've definitely seen that. I think what we've done as a consequence is work with a team that does a lot of security analyzing around our teams. So they do an analysis of both their digital safety as well as their physical safety. There have been some situations in which we've had security around us, physical security, even in the United States. So in this case, I'm talking about here rather than abroad. You know, we've always had security details in some cases, but yeah, there definitely is that, and we're definitely cognizant of that, and we definitely look at every single thing we can. All of our names are on lists that we are always checking constantly, and yeah, it's really disappointing that we have to do that. But again, it's that idea of like looking so you can see, so you're aware. You know, don't turn away from it. Look towards it so that you can be prepared, especially for the people that we support in the field.
Has anybody else had any experience with this on the front lines there?
Yeah, I can speak to it. You know, here in the city of Richmond, we've had both right-wing extremist and militia groups here at the protests, particularly that have sort of coalesced around Confederate monuments. And then we also had that large Second Amendment rally that made national news at the Virginia State Capitol here in Richmond back, I believe, in January or February, where there were very obvious right-wing militia members at these events. And I think, you know, it's kind of like Rainey said earlier, you have to prepare for the worst case situation. And, you know, and also to amplify Rainey, you know, you have to do the homework. You really have to be, you know, on Twitter, on social media, and trying your best that you can to monitor some of these groups and some of these people, or following folks who monitor these groups of right-wing militias. And really, at the end of the day, I mean, you need to get all the information, and then it just comes down to, you know, your value judgment of how important is telling this story to our community versus, you know, any potential hazards that I see that might arise in this protest or whatever it is you're covering.
Right. I mean, I'm really cognizant of this incongruity that at the very moment that we all seem to have finally agree that Black and Brown people need to be out there telling the stories, it's also the most dangerous time for us all to be telling these stories, and how we, you know, how we get past that is going to be a learning experience, and something we have to, I think, also be aware of, right, when we're sending different people out to different scenarios. There's a question about what we can do to advocate for safety, for press freedom. And I think, you know, what's interesting about this conversation is that the notion of safety and press freedom has just gotten so much more complicated in the last few months. And, you know, what we're talking about is so vast and fast moving. So I don't know if anybody wants to take that on, but, you know, certainly we could think of advocacy at the very bottom of, like, let's have hazard pay, and let's make sure that whoever's hiring us is doing the right things, all the way to how do we get Maria Ressa from going to prison. So I don't know if anybody wants to tackle that, but Jackie, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to say just generally about when you talk about the freedom of the press and the dangers that the press is under now, is I think it's really important to acknowledge that the protesters are under that same danger, which is why the press is being targeted in the way that they are. And when we have conversations that are separate from that, without that acknowledgement, it suggests that the lives of the press are more valuable, in the press who've generally been in the mainstream white for a long time. And so that's one of the things to be cautious of as we talk about that. And the other thing that that there needs to be more, needs to be a deeper look at structural racism within journalism. And so I heard an interview on NPR, and I don't remember the gentleman's name, but he was the head of a journalist union, and he was asked about the rate of attack on the press. And then he was asked about if he had any sense, and he gave numbers, if he had any sense of the rate, if there was a greater rate on the attack against Black and Brown journalists. And he said, no, we haven't researched that. Well, that's not acceptable. And so that's one of the things that we need to look at as we start to really pay more attention to systemic racism is what can we do in journalism to tackle that within the institution, among ourselves and our colleagues, but also in the greater community.
Yeah, absolutely. We just have a few minutes left, and I really want to hear from each of you. And I think this is kind of a good final question. And I also just want to thank you, Jackie, for pointing that out about, you know, there's no life out there that's more valuable than anybody else's, and we have to be protecting everyone as best we can. And we haven't talked about subjects very much here today, you know, but it is something that weighs heavily on my mind about how we're protecting people on the other side of the camera. But the question is, you know, what, if we're in a moment where, to me, every story is an ethical decision, do we go out there? Does this merit the risks that the crew and that the people involved are taking? I'd love to hear from each of you as we sum up. And Nosheen, maybe we'll start with you. It's like, you know, what stories merit taking the risks? How do you decide that? And I'm going to ask that of each of you.
I hate to be in the hot seat for what I think is the hardest question. But I think I'll say to Jackie's point, like, it's not just like what's the story, but who's telling it and how is it being framed. And I think that's really important for me when I come on board and I consider whether or not I want to also take on those risks for that project.
Thank you. And thank you for being here, Nosheen. How about Sarah? How about you next?
Well, when I was doing the COVID film, the doctor's husband was really angry that she agreed to be interviewed. And he kept saying, people are dying and you're making a film. And I felt such anxiety about walking through her house and doing the interview in her courtyard, but she wanted to tell the story. And it seemed to be a story that meant a lot to people that watched it. So that's kind of my guide, is if someone is really willing to tell their story, they feel like that it matters.
Jackie.
Yeah, I want to first say I appreciate hearing everyone's point of view. Now more than ever, we're working siloed in our homes, and so it's great to be in this kind of conversation. One of the things I think about beyond just whether or not, which is important to consider, is whether or not the story is really important enough to dig into now. I also think about the timing. There's a story that I'm doing with a family who's been the victim of racial terrorism. And I think, do they need to talk about it now, or can I wait a month from now when they've had time to process, when it might be safer in terms of COVID to have those conversations and to do those interviews. And so those questions are really important to dig in and to talk really deeply with your crew.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Doesn't have to happen right now. Well, Roberto, your work does kind of have to happen right now. But you know, are there things where you have to decide to opt out?
Yeah, I mean, for us, you know, our situation is maybe a little unique from others on the panel just because we are, you know, reporting daily. We have the daily sort of deadline, as well as, you know, we are hyper focused on Richmond. And I think for us, that is sort of the driver of what is important and is it worth the risk. Is, you know, we live in this community. And we try our best to serve the community in which we live and participate. And so for us, the question is, you know, who's participating in this? Is this a conversation that is happening that we think is important enough that the rest of the community needs to, that we can amplify it and try to get the rest of the community involved? And, you know, obviously when our city is seeing thousands of people protest at the size that we've never seen before, and you know, violence that we've never seen before. For us, that certainly is something that is important to our community and a story that needs to be told. But I think that focus for us is, you know, is this important to our community right now?
Right. And Rainey, you guys have been acting fast. I mean, you've been turning films around really quickly, trying to cover and uncover, you know, how we got to where we are. What kinds of calculations are you making? How are you, you know, thinking about each story that gets told, and what has to maybe fall by the wayside right now?
I think actually you could take what everybody said collectively and say that goes into our thinking. And I especially appreciate Jackie's thoughts. And she's a fellow actually with Frontline right now. We're looking at some of her stories. These are decisions we're making all day long. I think the most important thing for me is that when it has accountability journalism in it, so it's holding those in power to account for these types of situations, then it feels valid to me. So if it's just like a drive-by right now, it's probably not of interest to me. But if we can actually do strong investigative journalism that talks about these ills, I think then it feels like it's valid. And that's when we go into the field. In some cases in the field, in some cases remote.
Well, I want to thank you all for being here. And it is a group, like my favorite thing actually is to bring different perspectives into these conversations so that we're not siloed and so that we're learning from each other and each other's practice and each other's concerns, frankly, because I think we'll get to a better place if we're all, you know, at the table.